I believe that the stars of heaven in Revelation 6 refers to the normal celestial stars that we think of when we use the word star, as opposed to merely meteorites. Having said that, it would not be impossible for it to be talking about meteorites, but I do believe that the context of Revelation 6, as well as comparable passages, um, gives us an understanding that it is the celestial stars. And I'll just start with verse 12. And I beheld when he had opened the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. And the stars of heaven fell into the earth, even as the fig tree casteth her untimely figs, when she is shaken of a mighty wind. And the heaven departed as a scroll when it is rolled together, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. So we see already, it mentions the sun, mentions the moon, mentions the stars of heaven. When you look at, when the Bible couples these things together, I mean, you're going to be hard pressed to say that it's meteorites as compared to the stars that we think of that come out at night, right? Or at least that are visible at night, right? So I believe just merely the mention of stars should just by default take us to the celestial objects that are visible at night. But furthermore, it mentions the heaven departed as a scroll when it was rolled together. So this is already a highly unusual event that's occurring. The heaven departing as a scroll, like that's not happened. I don't think anyone can say that's ever happened in history. So this is an entirely unique event on the day of the Lord. And if the heaven is departing as a scroll, I mean, you got to look at the relevant passages such as, Isaiah 34, Isaiah 13, and like if the heavens departing, like you're basically seeing the dissolving of the heavens. But yet, since we know that Revelation 6, 7, 8, 9 lay out events in chronological order, which is also, I would say, ultimately the backbone of the post-trib, pre-wrath rapture, is the chronology of that and how easy it is to demonstrate that those chapters are indeed in chronological order, and any other opposing view has to complicate the simplicity and just easy to show demonstration of that. But anyway, if the heaven is being dissolved, and yet in Revelation chapter 8, taking place after the events in Revelation chapter 6, you have, for example, like in Revelation 8:10, and the third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp, and it fell upon the third part of the rivers, and upon the fountains of waters. So, yet there's still a heaven. Well, let me say this: there is a heaven in Revelation chapter 8. And if it's a star falling from heaven, it certainly sounds like we were dealing with the normal heaven that we think of. So if it's departed in Revelation chapter 6, how do we then get a heaven in Revelation chapter 8? Well, that has caused some people, particularly those who believe in a more traditional post-trib view of the rapture happening after the 7 years, or pre-tribbers who believe are in a rapture before the 7 years, or potentially at the start of the 7 years. Some of them might point out, well, that's why you have to have Revelation chapter 8 occurring before, or let me say it this way, at least some of the events in Revelation chapter 8 taking place before Revelation chapter 6, or at least the sixth seal in Revelation chapter 6, because they see that there's like worse things happening potentially in Revelation 6 with the celestial events versus just a star falling from heaven in Revelation chapter 8. That doesn't sound as impactful, if you will, compared to the stars of heaven falling onto the earth. And I want to say it's either Isaiah 34 or Isaiah 13 referring to all the stars of heaven falling onto the earth. So how do you go from basically the annihilation of the heavens and stars to then having a heaven and a star? Actually, we know it's stars as well from Revelation 8:12, when it mentions the the third part of the stars, and the third part of them is darkened, so that the day shone out for a third part of it, and the night likewise. So you have to deal with this, this reality that if you're going to say that Revelation 6, 7, 8, 9 are in chronological order, which they definitely are, and then recognize that, hey, in Revelation 6 at the sixth seal, there's, this seemingly worse thing that's happening there as compared to, a star falling, or, just a third part of the stars being impacted, right? Versus in Revelation 6, with relevant passages such as Isaiah 13, Isaiah 34, it's like all of the stars impacted. So it gets slightly confusing, but all this is to say that what I believe is definitely going on is there is a restoration of the heavens that God does after he has caused the heaven to depart as a scroll in Revelation chapter 6. So it's not going to be too long afterwards that you're then going to have a heaven again. So he's going to restore the heavens, he's going to restore the stars. Whether or not he creates entirely fresh ones, or it's hard to say exactly what's happening there. I would just point out that the Bible does teach that angels are stars, for example, Revelation chapter 12. So as to exactly how all this is going to work, we can't say with 100% certainty, but I am convinced that because it's without a doubt the Revelation 6, 7, 8, 9 are in chronological order, therefore we have a restoration of heaven that occurs sometime between Revelation 6 and 8 that isn't mentioned, because simply the fact that later Revelation 8 there is a star that falls from heaven, and then you're also going to have a third part of the stars darkened. So if they've all been dissolved or fell into the earth in Revelation 6, how do you go from having a heaven to having stars? Well, you have to have a restoration. So with God all things are possible. So that's just how it works. So there's that. And then just the fact that, again, the heaven departed as a scroll, that's an unusual event, right? That's a keystone moment in the events in Revelation. And you couple with the fact that the sun and moon, the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. These are extraordinary events. So basically, if we have extraordinary event with the sun and the moon, we have extraordinary event with the heaven, why can't we have an extraordinary event with the stars of heaven, the celestial stars? So it's all extraordinary. So let's just go with that, and as opposed to trying to, I don't know, minimize the damage, if you will, just trying to come up with an interpretation that seemingly makes these things non-contradictory, but I think ultimately at the end of the day doesn't survive the best context, the best use of the relevant passages. I just think it's a little bit of cherry picking to say that, hey, when the stars fall, that's meteorites, but then when the stars are darkened, hey, that's the regular stars. No, I think it's referring to all of that. And another thing just to note here, so when it mentions the moon became as blood, well, there's other passages refer to the moon being darkened. And so that indicates to me the moon showing no light, versus if you have the moon turned to blood, which I actually do believe literally means it's going to be turned to blood. I don't just think that means it's turning red, although I would assume that, yeah, it will turn red, but then later be darkened completely. So basically from red blood to black blood would appear to be the case. So you're going to have on the day of the Lord the sun being darkened, the moon turning to blood, and then you also have to, I believe, later have to understand that the moon will be turned completely black. It'll be darkened just as the sun is darkened and not visible, so that there's no light on that day. Because otherwise, if you have the sun darkened but the moon is blood, is that going to be the only object? Right as Christ returns? No, I think the sun is clearly darkened, as well as the moon, as well as the stars, so that the light of Christ will be alone the light on that day. So, I hope that's a help. I definitely see the stars of heaven referring to the celestial objects we normally think of as opposed to meteorites. And I do want to note that, hey, when the Lord shakes the heavens and the earth removes out of her place in the wrath of the Lord of the hosts in the day of his fierce anger, yeah, I mean, look, there could be meteorites in the normal sense, but another thing to keep in mind is, as the stars are falling onto the earth, because then some of the objections might be, oh, then the earth is gonna be totally wiped out even just by one star. Well, we don't know what God is going to do to a star before it lands on the earth. If it is a celestial object, like, why couldn't it be that in its path to the earth that it also is dissolving, and then just it's basically fragments of that star or elements of that star that are landing. So basically, I'm saying is as it falls, it's losing energy or losing the matter that in comparison to what it was before it fell. So it's not going to be completely the same object, when it lands on the earth as opposed to when it was, in heaven, in its normal abode, basically. So we don't know. And when I'm saying we don't know, what I'm trying to indicate is I do believe that God is going to alter the condition of the star so that when it lands on Earth, it's not going to wipe the Earth out, because you clearly have to have the Earth around for Jesus to return to. So, hope that's a help. And then, by the way, if the stars are basically kind of fiery balls of gas and they're kind of made of iron and various elements that are kind of produced through the nuclear reaction, if you will, in stars, you're just going to have a kind of a different thing landing on the Earth as opposed to the full thing that would completely wipe out the Earth. And plus, again, God is shaking the heavens violently, and those are going to land on the Earth. So, and it does also mention about, the heavens being changed. I do think that it is the celestial objects, but it's going to be, when they land, they're not going to wipe out the Earth, basically. Whatever scientist, says that, it would have to wipe out the Earth, well, no, because God is God and he can do as he pleases. God's able to do, the impossible, right? That's how I see things going down for Revelation 6 with the stars of heaven. Things like a restoration of the heavens a bit later. So Revelation 8 can be fulfilled. The complete dissolving of the stars in Revelation 6. Those are observations I've made, and hopefully some of you have realized something like this. But if you haven't, maybe this is your first time being introduced to thoughts like this. So hope this has helped, and God bless.